Last time I introduced you to Rate Your Music user Qwerty100 and his strange, pathological microanalysis of the behaviors of the stereotypical hipster. This time we actually begin to look at the bands and artists which he considers to be quintessential additions to the Hipster collection. And if you missed that video, it'll be in the cards or an annotation. Oh wait, you can't do annotations anymore. Thanks, YouTube. First on Qwerty's chopping block is the Velvet Underground, a somewhat short-lived band from New York City who were active in the late 60s and early 70s. They would prove to be essential in the development of punk rock and new wave, and their best albums have frequently been listed as some of the greatest in the history of rock and experimental music. But what does Qwerty have to say about them?
Hey, look, they're all wearing glasses. Is it that sunny in NY, or are they just trying to tell us how cool they are?
I assume he's referring to this photograph, one of the most iconic ever taken of the Velvets. I'm not so sure why he's so hung up on them all wearing sunglasses, considering how many metal bands he likes, which have posed for very similar photos. Not exactly holding our artists to the same standards here, are we?
The band that directly connects hipster rock with the useless, overblown, charlatan, mega-hipster world of pop art. Even if Andy Warhol had picked the Osmonds to be in the infamous Andy Warhol Chocolate Factory, they would have now had the stature of Lou's band. Let me rephrase that. If he had picked a wedding band that played Disney songs, that band would have had the same undeserved stature that TVU enjoys. Andy was no artist, but he was a magician of sorts. He could touch shit and make it turn to gold. Sort of a modern-day alchemist, except that the gold isn't really gold, it only appears that way to hipsters.
So far, it seems like Qwerty's only beef with the Velvets is that their manager was Andy Warhol, someone that he denies the title of artist to. Much of Qwerty's criticism of the bands on this list will boil down to non-musical criticisms like this. It seems to me like that's a violent clash with his whole support music, not image mantra, but I'll let you be the judge of that as time passes. My thoughts, or anyone's thoughts for that matter, on Andy Warhol aren't really relevant to this discussion. Suffice to say, there's no Velvet Underground without Warhol. The two are inexorably linked from an artistic standpoint. Qwerty's outright dismissal of Warhol's art in this paragraph is generally indicative of Qwerty's aversion to music evolving in ways he deems unsavory for any number of reasons that have less to do with the music itself and more so the attitude and outlook of the people who are associated with it. You'll notice that throughout most of his rant on the Velvet Underground, he rarely makes any attempt to actually discuss and evaluate the actual music that they created. Get used to that.
Hence, it should be no surprise that Andy Warhol's rock project hobby band should turn out to be the band that started the first mini-waves of hipsterism. I say mini-waves because full-fledged widespread hipsterism didn't catch on until millennials showed up. Why millennials? I discuss this topic in more detail later on, but let's just say that one of the key reasons might be that this generation has no rock revolution to latch onto and make their own. Baby boomers had Elvis and the Beatles, they had the 60s, they had 70s prog rock and hard rock, Generation Xers had grunge, extreme metal, and other things, but what do millennials have? Absolutely nothing. In other words, Rihanna. They're the generations that found/find themselves in an artistic vacuum, an era with little or no innovation in every respect. Hence, perhaps, the desperate decision of millennials to turn emoism and then full-on hipsterism as means of finding their own identity. Some identity.
This paragraph in particular is really giving me a Prison Planet vibe. Remember this from The Truth About Popular Culture?
Young people were once able to channel their self-loathing, their anger, through the medium of rebellious music. Think punk, grunge, goth. Now, they're all growing up listening to sterile drivel like One Direction and Maroon 5.
Sounds awfully similar to this, doesn't it? How much of Qwerty's silly ranting is just modified versions of PJW videos is a question I don't have the fortitude to answer. But more to Qwerty's point, there's actually a pretty sizable millennial musical movement happening right now that goes far beyond Rihanna. It's a style of music that came out of the Bronx in the late 1970s, but has only very recently been able to garner any real legitimacy in mainstream culture. I know you know what I mean, Qwerty. You've given half-star ratings to some of this genre's founding documents. Face it, hip-hop is the music of today. It's currently the most popular genre of music in America, and has had a tremendous impact on all sorts of music being made all around the globe. You can hate hip-hop, though I'd ask you to reconsider that position, but you can't deny the facts. Calling the millennial era an era with little to no innovation in every respect, in the face of albums from Nas, A Tribe Called Quest, Kanye West, Outkast, Kendrick Lamar, and countless others, is just proof to me that Cordy is completely out of touch. So all this hubbub is to say that Cordy views the Velvet Underground as a proto-hipster band, and I guess in some sense he's kind of right. In their more intense, wild, and overblown moments, they embody the attitude of punk rock soon to follow, along with their contemporaries in the Stooges, and the influence their softer, more melodic songs created can be felt on a whole lot of indie rock albums from the 90s. And in addition to that, the sound they forged on Loaded was sort of a foresight of the glam rock era of the 70s. You'll notice I mentioned the Velvet Underground's influence on indie rock. No wonder the elitist metalhead isn't a fan.
For some bizarre but typically hipster reasons, hipsters usually only select 2 to 3 albums from a band to worship. Everything that comes after that is pretty much ignored as if it were never recorded. Often it's just one album that gets the holy treatment. The other releases are ignored to an astonishing extent. It's as if hipsters believe that artists have a narrow window of time when they are touched by divinity and when they can create sublime art, and that the rest of the band's career is just a waste of time because that divine inspiration will never come back again, as it indeed never existed before that short amount of time, when the gods of hipsterdom shone their magic sun rays on them. King Arthur got to extract Excalibur just once from that stone, right? It works similarly in hipsterism.
Or maybe it's just that Rate Your Music's user base and people who listen to music in general tend to listen to less music by more artists. Or maybe even more simply than that, there are just certain albums that are singled out as an artist's all-time best work, and people tend to listen to the albums that are considered an artist's best before anything else. I think the real issue here is a lot simpler than you might realize.
But when it comes to TUV, it seems they got to take out Excalibur 4 times, which places them firmly into the top echelon of hipster music. TVU is a rare exception. All 4 albums by the underground Velvetians are to be worshipped. In the hipster world, 4 albums is a lot to worship per band. I'll talk about the hipster quota system later.
Let me just nitpick this. First, this acronym is wrong. The Underground Velvet. And secondly, there are actually 5 Velvet Underground albums, but this 5th one is generally considered a massive stinker. This little paragraph reiterates a common point throughout Cordy's writing, namely the whole hipsters are a hive mind that all listen to the same music, which has been approved by the Hipster Council bit. If you want a perspective from somebody that Cordy would probably consider a hipster, hence the title of this series, I do think the first 2 albums are undeniably essential rock and roll music with an oddball avant-garde sensibility, and even the 3rd album has some really great moments, but Loaded never really did it for me in the way that, White Light, White Heat did, for instance. That set of opinions I just rattled off there would probably be enough to render Cordy's point about albums that all hipsters must worship upon converting to the hipster's lifestyle null and void, if I felt like being really pedantic, but the truth is even Cordy will admit that there are exceptions to every rule, so I'm not off the hook just yet. Next, he links to his own review of White Light, White Heat, which he has of course rated half a star, and here it starts to become really apparent that he just isn't funny at all.
I can certainly see how this band can evoke romantic images of sheer nostalgia for people who were part of that period, but I struggle to understand what young kids find, or think they find, in this kind of dated, uninteresting music. Perhaps I am the deaf one, perhaps I am the clueless oaf who fails to grasp the power of the dark side of the Force. Luke, join me! Sorry, got confused there for a moment.
Tell me you didn't cringe massively at that sentence there. Next, Cordy waxes philosophical about the hipster brain, again.
Effort equals bourgeois, talent equals bourgeois, skill equals bourgeois, ambition in anything is anti-intellectual, sheepy bourgeois mentality, something a pompous hipster will smugly sneer at from the lofty heights of his mega-intellectual cloud. The hipster sees himself as some sort of god, sitting high above, watching the stupid little rat race ants waste their existence on pursuing lowly traditional goals, such as creating food that feeds the hipster, something hipsters either aren't aware of or are in denial about. Tradition equals bourgeois, new equals progressive and hip, because all of our ancestors were somehow other idiots who are hipsters, and those like them, for example hippies, have all
Jesus Christ, I thought this was supposed to be about the Velvet Underground. Oh, wait. let me skip forward a bit. Now we're back in business.
VU were a shock value band before bands were particularly shocking. This certainly goes a certain way in explaining their baffling appeal, considering they were musically inept. Their lyrics were designed to irritate and titillate like a bunch of 6th graders trying too hard to be rebels. Their song themes are a what's what of rock rebellion and nihilism, hipster faves, heroin, getting heroin, S&M, sex change operations, transvestites. That's how you do it when your music can't speak loudly. Or at least that's how it used to work, cause nowadays rock doesn't shock anyone with anything. So Lou was extremely lucky, cause he was at the right place at the right time, and often that's all it takes to succeed.
What's all this about the Velvets being inept at songwriting? Sure, they may use simple chord progressions a lot of the time. Often they'll just simply riff on the 1 and 4 chords for a long time, and they may only ever use 1 chord sometimes, or no chords in their Sister Ray moments where things get chaotic and tumultuous, but how much difference is there between the simplicity of Femme Fatale and any number of ABBA songs, for instance, or the cacophony of European Sun and the chaos of a Mr. Bungle album? For me, these things are more connected than they might seem on the surface. Why confuse simplicity or exploration of sonic extremes with musical ineptitude? After all, those are 2 qualities of what the Velvet Underground did that I think really cement them as a band who were ahead of their time. As for the Velvet Underground's lyrical content, to imply that they weren't shocking to most mainstream audiences would be completely misguided. Their first album, The Velvet Underground and Nico, which included songs about sex workers and heroin use, only sold 30,000 copies in the first 5 years following its release. Clearly they weren't in this whole music thing to appeal to the masses, at least not right away. I mean, Loaded only sounds the way it does because the band was under pressure from their management to make an album that would be commercially successful. But lyrics like the ones found on The Velvet Underground and Nico and White Light White Heat, which is arguably a much more shocking album lyrically and musically, actually got the band kicked off of MGM Records in 1968. Clearly somebody higher up the food chain wasn't all too pleased with what they were doing. QWERTY's conclusion is as follows.
TUV are a must for any self-respecting, self-loving hipster. If you don't like TUV, you're not a hipster. It's that simple. It would be like a thrash metal fan who hates all Metallica albums. Believe it or not, I personally know such a specimen. Then again, if you like them, you aren't necessarily a hipster, but the odds that you worship TUV yet aren't a hipster are relatively low. Because frankly, what serious music fan in their right mind could possibly be interested in such shoddily played, badly written, and boring music? It's like a lazy jam session posing as art. Nice try, guys. You couldn't have fooled me with that trick, ever.
There he goes again, calling them the Underground Velvet. 3 times. Typing errors aside, I think it's safe to say that QWERTY just doesn't understand what the Velvet Underground was about. Shoddily played, badly written, and boring. You may think they're boring, and their instrumental ability was definitely not virtuosic, but you can't say what they were doing was badly written or otherwise poorly conceived. Very few bands before them, or since for that matter, made as much headway into such a unique sonic space as they did when they were in their peak form. They were one of the first rock bands to combine rock music with avant-garde sensibilities, and even in their more simplified moments, they were no slouches in terms of composition. Even when they're riffing on just 1 chord, they do so with a purpose. I've barely scratched the surface of why I think the Velvet Underground is one of the greatest rock bands of all time. QWERTY regards them as being a hipster essential, which may very well be true, but why is that such a bad thing? If you take them out of the history of rock music, a whole lot of music simply never would have happened in the way that it did. They're one of those best bands you've never heard of, your favorite band's favorite band. They're on that level of being relatively obscure and massively influential at the same time. Everybody knows this quote from Brian Eno, right? The one where he says, the Velvet Underground and Nico only sold about 30,000 copies in its first 5 years, but pretty much everybody that bought it started a band. Chalking their appeal up to merely their association with Andy Warhol, or their lyrics, or the nihilistic outlook of the millennial hipsters who profess their greatness, misses out on a much bigger picture. If you think QWERTY's being short-sighted here, I'd agree with you, but I'd also ask you to bear in mind that this is merely the first rant out of over 125. Next time, we'll look at QWERTY's assessments of jazz and 3 of the greatest jazz musicians of all time: Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and Charles Mingus. This one's gonna sting. Stay a legend.